Lying in the suffocating dust of a Kansas alleyway, a 21-year-old outlaw named Emmett Dalton was rapidly bleeding to death. Shredded by 23 lead pellets, with the mutilated corpses of his two older brothers baking in the sun just inches away. This grim scene was supposed to be the definitive end of a gang. Instead, it is merely the prologue to the real Emmett Dalton, the most humiliating fate of an American outlaw. Fast forward a quarter of a century, and the sole survivor of the Dalton Gang is not rotting in a forgotten grave. He is standing beneath the blinding artificial glare of a Hollywood film set, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, soaking in the thunderous applause of the cultural elite. The true, chilling tragedy of his life is not the barrage of buckshot that decimated his family. It is his ultimate psychological compromise. When he finally walked free from a prison cell, he realized that his family's blood was a highly marketable commodity. Nobody forced him into the capitalist machine. He willingly sold his soul to the spotlight. He established his own film company, strapped on a prop cowboy holster, and meticulously choreographed the violent execution of his own flesh and blood, all to sell admission tickets to a cheering public. The Daltons didn't start as criminals. They were deputy U.S. Marshals. But when their eldest brother was killed in the line of duty for pathetic government wages, they realized the law offered nothing but an early grave. They traded their badges for masks and turned to robbing trains. Yet greed wasn't their downfall. Ego was. The gang's leader, Bob Dalton, was violently obsessed with eclipsing the legendary Jesse James. Craving historical immortality, Bob devised a suicidal spectacle: rob two heavily fortified banks simultaneously, in broad daylight, right in their own childhood hometown of Coffeyville. He assumed the locals would freeze in terror. It was a masterclass in toxic arrogance. The architecture of the Coffeyville raid was not drawn up with the meticulous, cautious precision of seasoned tacticians. It was sketched entirely on the unstable, volatile canvas of Bob Dalton's megalomania. Choosing Coffeyville, a bustling, prosperous economic hub in Montgomery County, Kansas, was not merely a logistical decision. It was a supreme act of psychological arrogance. The Dalton family had actually lived in the area. They had walked those wooden pavements, bought supplies in those stores, and mingled with the very citizens they now intended to terrorize. To rob a town where your faces are deeply etched into the local memory requires a level of hubris that borders on the pathological. Bob Dalton did not just want to steal money. He wanted to look the society that had rejected him directly in the eye and publicly humiliate it. He wanted to strip the town of its wealth in broad daylight, proving that the Daltons operated entirely above the laws of mortal men. The physical layout of the target was daunting enough to deter any rational outlaw. The town plaza was a wide, open expanse of hard-packed dirt, flanked by sturdy brick and timber buildings. Sitting directly across from one another, separated by the wide, exposed thoroughfare, were the two most heavily fortified financial institutions in the region, the Condon Bank and the First National Bank. Attempting to hit one of these vaults would have been a perilous undertaking, requiring the element of total surprise and a flawless, rapid extraction. To hit both simultaneously meant dividing a small gang of 5 men into 2 even weaker units. isolating them on opposite sides of a killing zone and relying entirely on the assumption that the local populace would simply freeze in a state of terrified compliance. Bob Dalton, utterly blinded by his own burgeoning legend, assumed the citizens of Coffeyville would cower under their desks the moment he drew his revolvers. He failed to account for the fact that the men of Kansas were hardened by the harsh realities of the frontier, many of them veterans of the Civil War, who were intimately acquainted with the mechanics of violence. On the crisp, frostbitten morning of October 5th, 1892, the 5 outlaws descended upon Coffeyville. In a grotesque display of theatricality, they paused on the outskirts of town to engage in a bizarre ritual. Fully aware they were riding into a community that had known them since childhood, they did not pull bandanas over their faces. Instead, they applied spirit gum and glued on cheap synthetic beards and heavy artificial mustaches. It was a pathetic, amateurish pantomime. Bob Dalton, a hardened killer, was essentially dressing up in a costume, treating an armed robbery like a stage play where he was the undisputed star. Their grand, terrifying spectacle began to unravel before a single weapon was drawn. As the heavy-set men rode quietly into the bustling plaza, Bob noticed that the paving stones in front of the banks had been recently torn up. The primary hitching posts were blocked by municipal rubble. Faced with this logistical hurdle, Bob made a fatal improvisation. He directed the gang to turn down a narrow, blind alleyway directly adjacent to a local hardware store. In the brutal geometry of urban warfare, an alleyway with only one exit is a death trap. By securing their getaway horses in this confined trench, Bob had effectively walled his men into a slaughterhouse of his own making. As they strode back out into the sunlight and split into 2 groups towards the banks, the illusion of their invincibility shattered within seconds. The theatrical disguises intended to project anonymous terror were utterly useless in the harsh morning light. A local merchant standing on the wooden boardwalk watched them pass, his eyes locking onto the crude, glue-stained edges of the fake beards. He peered beneath the brim of Bob's Stetson, and a cold realization washed over him. He did not scream or panic. He simply turned and delivered a whisper that moved through Coffeyville with the invisible, terrifying speed of a plague. "The Daltons are robbing the bank." The town did not freeze. It mobilized with grim, silent fury. Directly across the street, Charles Isham's hardware store became the epicenter of resistance. Ordinary men rushed through the doors, smashing the glass of the display cabinets to grab brand new factory-oiled Winchester repeating rifles. They tore open boxes of heavy-caliber ammunition, the brass cartridges spilling across the floorboards. Moving with predatory stealth, hardware merchants and stable hands took up elevated fortified positions on the flat tar paper roofs. They pulled back the hammers of their weapons with sharp metallic clicks, establishing a deadly overlapping crossfire. The silent, invisible architecture of a massacre had been perfectly assembled. The trap was set, and the town was simply waiting for the outlaws to step outside. The heavy, brass-handled doors of the First National Bank swung outward, and Bob and Emmett Dalton stepped past the threshold onto the raised wooden boardwalk. The transition from the hushed, cavernous interior of the financial institution to the blinding glare of the Kansas morning was abrupt, but it was the unnatural, suffocating silence of the Coffeyville Plaza that registered as fundamentally terrifying. The bustling agrarian commerce that had filled the streets a mere 10 minutes prior had entirely vanished. Supply wagons sat abandoned in the middle of the wide thoroughfare, their wooden wheels sinking slightly into the dust. Draft horses, left tethered to their hitching posts, pawed nervously at the hard-packed dirt, their ears pinned flat against their skulls as they sensed the heavy static electricity of an impending storm. There were no merchants sweeping the storefronts, no women walking beneath the awnings, no children running between the rain barrels. The town square was completely devoid of civilian movement, yet it possessed the dense, lethal atmosphere of a coiled spring. Bob Dalton, gripping a heavy canvas sack stuffed with stolen currency, stepped forward. His cold eyes scanned the flat tar paper roofs and the shadowed recessed doorways of the brick buildings directly opposite their position. The crude, glue-stained false beard he wore began to itch fiercely against his jawline in the rising heat, a ridiculous dime store disguise that had been completely stripped of its intended menace. For a fraction of a second, the legendary outlaw leader stood frozen, attempting to process the total and catastrophic failure of his grand, terrifying spectacle. He had anticipated utter submission. He had fully expected a frontier town paralyzed by the mere whispered invocation of the Dalton name. He did not expect the cold, calculated geometry of a meticulously prepared, highly armed ambush. The fragile illusion of their invincibility was shattered not by a sheriff's demand for surrender, nor by a shouted warning, but by the sharp, deafening crack of a high-caliber Winchester rifle fired from a concealed elevation. The heavy lead projectile tore across the open plaza at supersonic speed, narrowly missing Bob's shoulder but slamming with devastating kinetic energy into the polished wooden doorframe just inches from Emmett's head. The violent impact sent a shower of jagged, razor-sharp wooden splinters exploding across the back of the 21-year-old's neck. That single concussive report acted as the definitive catalyst. It was the spark that instantly transformed the peaceful Kansas municipality into an active militarized slaughterhouse. Instantly, the entire perimeter of the plaza erupted in a continuous, deafening roar of overlapping gunfire. The citizens of Coffeyville, ordinary men who had been weighing flour, cutting fabric, and fitting horseshoes mere moments ago, unleashed a coordinated barrage from the roofs, the second-story windows, and the narrow alleyways. The crisp autumn air was immediately torn apart by the sonic cracks of repeating rifles and the heavy, booming thunder of double-barreled shotguns. White, acrid clouds of sulphurous gun smoke began to billow from the storefronts, pouring over the wooden awnings and drifting heavily into the dirt streets, blinding the outlaws and choking their lungs. The sheer volume of incoming fire was staggering. Lead bullets slammed relentlessly into the brick facade of the First National Bank, ricocheting with high-pitched metallic whines, chipping away chunks of mortar, and sending a continuous rain of red brick dust cascading down upon the brothers' shoulders. The large plate glass windows of the bank shattered inward, showering the interior lobby with thousands of lethal glass daggers. Bob Dalton's megalomaniacal plan had fatally trapped them on the wrong side of the kill zone. To reach the blind alleyway where they had foolishly tethered their getaway horses, they would have to cross the open, completely exposed thoroughfare, running directly through the epicenter of a concentrated crossfire. Realizing the front exit was a suicidal choke point, Bob grabbed Emmett by the collar of his coat, physically hauling him backward. They retreated into the ruined bank, slipping on the glass-strewn floorboards, shoved past the terrified clerks cowering behind the mahogany counters, and kicked open the heavy wooden back door. They burst out into a narrow, debris-filled rear lot that ran parallel to the main street, beginning a desperate, frantic sprint. Their boots pounded against the hard earth as they desperately tried to navigate the labyrinth of wooden fences, chicken coops, and storage sheds to reach their mounts. Meanwhile, directly across the wide, bullet-torn plaza, a parallel nightmare had already unfolded inside the Condon Bank. Grat Dalton, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Power had been pinned down the moment the first shot rang out. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Condon Bank had exploded inward under a synchronized volley from the citizens positioned in Isham's hardware store. The three outlaws had been forced to dive onto their bellies, crawling through the glittering, blood-drawing glass as bullets shredded the wooden paneling around them. Realizing the front door meant instant death, they too had kicked open their rear exit, scrambling into the back alleys in a desperate bid to link up with Bob and Emmett. The uncompromising geography of the town had now funneled all 5 members of the Dalton Gang towards a single fatal bottleneck, Death Alley. This was the narrow blind corridor running alongside the hardware store where Bob Dalton, in his supreme arrogance, had secured their only means of escape. As Bob and Emmett emerged from the rear lots and turned the corner into the alleyway, they were met with a solid wall of flying lead. The citizens of Coffeyville had perfectly anticipated their extraction route. Hardware merchants, stable hands, and local farmers had positioned themselves at the mouth of the alley, and on the adjacent rooftops, their rifles resting steadily on brick parapets and wooden crates. The outlaws were no longer fighting a disorganized mob of civilians. They were facing a highly motivated, entrenched militia defending their own homes and livelihoods. The alleyway instantly became a claustrophobic cauldron of absolute violence. The air grew so thick with smoke that it burned the eyes, smelling heavily of raw cordite, pulverized earth, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. The noise was absolute, a continuous rolling thunder of detonations, the frantic, terrifying whinnying of the tethered draft horses, and the sharp metallic clatter of spent brass casings raining down upon the wooden boardwalks. The horses, terrified by the continuous explosions and the stinging shrapnel of splintered wood, pulled violently at their leather tethers. They screamed and reared up on their hind legs, their iron-shod hooves kicking out wildly, creating massive, unpredictable physical obstacles within the narrow, confined trench. Grat Dalton, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Power finally managed to fight their way through the rear lots, converging on the alleyway just as the crossfire reached its absolute peak. The 5 outlaws were now reunited, trapped together in a narrow ditch of death, desperately trying to untie panicked horses while being fired upon from 3 different elevations. It was here, in the dirt, the horse manure, and the blinding smoke of the blind alley, that the mythological legend of the invincible Dalton Gang was violently, methodically dismantled. The destruction of the gang was not a cinematic, choreographed sequence of noble sacrifices. It was a chaotic, gruesome display of blunt physical trauma and the unforgiving physics of high-velocity ammunition. Bill Power was the first to be eradicated. He made a desperate, frantic lunge toward his horse, his hands reaching blindly for the leather reins. A heavy-caliber rifle bullet fired from the roof of the hardware store struck him squarely between the shoulder blades. The kinetic energy of the round lifted his entire body completely off its feet, driving him face first into the dirt. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling violently, coughing up bright, frothy arterial blood before collapsing into a recessed doorway. He was dead before the smoke had even cleared from the barrel of the gun that killed him. Dick Broadwell, witnessing Power's sudden death, abandoned all pretenses of fighting back. He was consumed by sheer animalistic panic. He threw himself onto the back of his horse, taking a heavy bullet straight through his back just as he scrambled into the saddle. Ignoring the devastating bleeding wound, he spurred the terrified animal, riding furiously out of the mouth of the alley and into the open street. He miraculously broke through the town's perimeter, his horse galloping wildly out of the municipal limits. But the human body can only endure so much catastrophic fluid loss. Broadwell managed to ride exactly half a mile out of Coffeyville before his blood pressure entirely collapsed. He fell heavily from the saddle, his corpse left staring blankly up at the Kansas sky in a muddy roadside ditch, dying completely alone. Inside the alley, Grat Dalton was bleeding from multiple superficial flesh wounds, his clothing torn and soaked in crimson. He backed up against a heavy wooden barn door, firing his revolver blindly into the thick, blinding smoke. A local city marshal named Charles Connolly, a courageous man who had sprinted across town to join the militia, stepped around the corner of the hardware store, raising his weapon. Great saw the movement through the haze, turned, and fired a single shot that struck the marshal in the abdomen, inflicting a fatal wound. But Great's tactical victory was measured in mere milliseconds. Before the marshal even hit the ground, a volley of return fire from the furious citizens tore into Grat. A heavy Winchester bullet struck him directly in the throat, instantly severing his carotid artery. A spray of blood hit the wooden barn door behind him. Grat dropped his revolver, clutching his ruined throat with both hands, his eyes wide with the sudden, shocking realization of his own mortality. He sank to his knees, choking violently on his own blood before falling forward into the dirt, joining Bill Power in the muddy, blood-soaked trench. Bob Dalton, the arrogant architect of this entire massacre, the man who had desperately sought to eclipse Jesse James, was now watching his grand historical spectacle collapse into a pile of butchered meat. He was bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound to his right arm, the limb hanging uselessly at his side. The heavy Winchester rifle he held was slick with his own blood. Refusing to surrender, driven entirely by the toxic, unyielding narcissism that had brought his family to this alley, he switched the heavy rifle to his left hand. He stood up straight, stepped out from behind the cover of a wooden shed, and walked directly into the open center of the alleyway, firing his weapon one-handed at the men on the roofs. It was an act of pure suicidal defiance, and the citizens of Coffeyville gladly obliged him. A heavy rifle bullet tore through Bob's chest, collapsing his right lung and fracturing several ribs. The brutal impact spun him around, but the sheer blinding arrogance of the man inexplicably kept him on his feet. He stumbled forward, gasping for air, the blood pouring down his torso, staining his shirt a dark, wet crimson. He raised the rifle again. Another bullet, this time fired at close range, struck him directly in the abdomen, tearing through his intestines and exiting his lower back. The devastating kinetic trauma finally severed his body's ability to remain upright. Bob Dalton sat down heavily on the edge of the wooden sidewalk. His rifle slipped from his blood-slicked fingers, clattering uselessly onto the paving stones. He slumped over onto his side, his cheek pressing into the cold, hard dirt of the town he had arrogantly believed he could conquer. The invincible leader of the Dalton Gang died not as a mythological god of the frontier, but as a broken, bleeding casualty of his own hubris. Emmett Dalton was now entirely alone. He was 21 years old, the youngest and most impressionable member of the gang, trapped in a narrow corridor of death alongside the mutilated corpses of his friends and his older brothers. He had taken a bullet through his right arm, a sharp, burning agony radiating from his bicep, and another round had grazed his left hip, soaking his trousers in warm blood. The air was deafening, the smell of gunpowder and voided bowels overpowering. The heavy canvas sack containing over $20,000 in stolen banknotes still hung heavily across his chest. In the midst of this absolute, unmitigated slaughter, Emmett Dalton experienced a moment of miraculous, inexplicable fortune. Through the thick, swirling clouds of gray gun smoke, he saw that his horse was still tethered, still alive, and standing relatively calm despite the surrounding carnage. The horse was positioned near the rear exit of the alley, slightly shielded from the direct crossfire by the bulk of a large wooden wagon. Emmett did not hesitate. Ignoring the burning agony in his arm and hip, he sprinted toward the animal. He grabbed the heavy leather pommel, his blood-stained hands slipping for a fraction of a second, before he violently hauled his body weight up into the saddle. He grabbed the reins, his boots finding the iron stirrups. He spurred the horse, turning its head toward the open, unblocked end of the alleyway. The citizens on the roofs were momentarily distracted by the deaths of Bob and Great, their fire briefly pausing as they assessed the smoke-filled trench below. Emmett Dalton had a perfectly clear avenue of escape. The dirt road leading out of Coffeyville lay completely open before him. He had the fastest horse in the gang beneath him, and he had the sack of stolen currency strapped tightly to his chest. He could ride out of that alley, disappear into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Indian Territory, and vanish into the shadows of history. He had survived the most catastrophic civilian ambush in the history of the West. He had won the brutal, bloody lottery of survival. He pulled the leather reins, the horse taking its first powerful stride toward freedom. But as the animal moved, Emmett made the fatal mistake of looking back over his shoulder. Through the thinning veil of gun smoke, he saw the body of his older brother. Bob Dalton was lying motionless in the dirt, his blood pooling darkly around him, his chest completely still. Bob, the charismatic, infallible leader. Bob, the brother who had taught him how to shoot, how to ride, and how to despise the constraints of the law. The sight of his idol lying broken and humiliated in the mud entirely shattered Emmett's survival instinct. The deep ingrained loyalty of blood, the very familial bond that had forged the gang in the first place, completely overrode all rational thought. Emmett simply could not ride away and leave his brother's corpse to be dragged through the streets, photographed and displayed like a slaughtered animal by the very townsfolk they had sought to humiliate in a decision that would dictate the rest of his agonizing life. Emmett Dalton pulled hard on the reins. He hauled the horse's head around, physically fighting the terrified animal's desperate instinct to flee the noise and the smoke. He turned the horse directly back into the concentrated kill zone. He rode the panicked animal back down the alleyway, straight toward the heavy crossfire. Bullets began to snap and hiss through the air around him once more, kicking up geysers of dirt and splintering the wooden walls. He spurred the horse forward until he reached the exact spot where Bob lay in the dust. Emmett brought the horse to a sudden violent halt, the animal rearing slightly, its hooves dancing nervously mere inches from his brother's lifeless body. Ignoring the intense, concentrated gunfire now directed entirely at his elevated position, Emmett leaned precariously over the side of the saddle. He reached his uninjured left arm down toward the dirt, his fingers desperately grasping for the thick leather collar of his brother's coat. He stretched his arm further down, his fingertips brushing the blood-soaked fabric. His entire focus, his entire world, had narrowed down to the desperate, impossible, and utterly futile task of hauling a dead weight up onto the back of a panicked horse. He was completely exposed, a stationary target suspended above a trench of death, blinded by grief and loyalty. At that precise moment, a local barber named Carrie Seaman, a man who had never held a gun in anger before that morning, stepped briskly around the corner of the brick building directly behind Emmett. Seaman was not carrying a Winchester repeating rifle. He was holding a short, heavy, double-barreled shotgun, loaded with large, devastating buckshot, ammunition specifically designed for stopping heavy game at close range. Seaman saw the young outlaw leaning over the side of the horse, his back completely exposed. There was no hesitation, no shouted demand for surrender, no warning. The time for law, order, and due process had expired the moment the Daltons rode into town wearing fake beards. Seaman raised the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun to his shoulder, aimed directly at the broad center of Emmett Dalton's back, and pulled the front trigger. The distance between the muzzle of the shotgun and Emmett's spine was less than 10 yards. The blast was deafening, a booming, concussive roar that temporarily drowned out the crack of the rifles. The physical impact of a close-range shotgun blast is catastrophic. The paper shell casing exploded, sending a tightly clustered, rapidly expanding pattern of heavy lead pellets tearing through the air at supersonic speed. 23 individual lead pellets struck Emmett Dalton simultaneously. They slammed mercilessly into his lower back, his right shoulder, and his hips. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact was like being struck by a runaway locomotive. The lead pellets tore through his heavy woolen coat, shredded his cotton shirt, and violently penetrated his flesh. They fractured his ribs, tore through his latissimus muscles, and lodged deep against his spine and pelvis, shattering bone and severing tissue. The devastating, overwhelming force of the blast lifted Emmett completely out of the leather saddle. The reins were ripped violently from his hands. He was thrown sideways through the air, completely paralyzed by the massive hydrostatic shock to his central nervous system. He crashed heavily into the hard-packed dirt of the alleyway, landing violently on his right shoulder. The canvas sack of stolen currency slipped from his chest, spilling tightly bound stacks of banknotes into the mud beside him. For several agonizing seconds, Emmett Dalton lay completely paralyzed in the dirt. The world around him had dissolved into a high-pitched, deafening ringing sound. He could not feel his legs. A cold, terrifying numbness began to spread rapidly from his shattered lower back, slowly being replaced by a deep, throbbing, radiating agony as the shock began to wear off, and his severed nerve endings registered the massive bodily trauma. He tasted raw dirt, copper, and dust. He tried to push himself up, his left hand pressing weakly against the muddy ground, but his body absolutely refused to obey. He collapsed back into the dirt, turning his head slowly to the side. His cheek was resting just inches from the blood-soaked boots of his brother Bob. A few feet away lay the mutilated, unrecognizable corpse of Grat Dalton. The mighty Dalton Gang, the arrogant young men who had ridden into town believing they were immortal gods of the frontier, had been completely, utterly annihilated in exactly 12 minutes of concentrated civic violence. The continuous, deafening roar of the gunfire slowly, gradually began to cease. The citizens of Coffeyville, peering cautiously over their rifle sights from the rooftops and from behind the hardware store counters, watched as the gun smoke drifted away on the morning breeze. The alleyway was completely silent, save for the heavy, labored, gurgling breathing of the youngest Dalton. Emmett closed his eyes in the mud, 23 pieces of lead burning inside him, fully expecting the final executing bullet to end his suffering. He was completely unaware that his survival would ultimately prove to be a fate far more excruciating and a psychological compromise far more degrading than a simple death in the dust. The citizens of Coffeyville did not offer the youngest Dalton the mercy of a quick, clean execution in the dirt. Dragged from the blood-soaked mud and laid roughly onto the wooden floorboards of a local pharmacy, Emmett descended into a specific, excruciating medical hell. In the crude, unforgiving era of frontier medicine, there was no sophisticated anesthesia or sterile operating theater. Illuminated only by the harsh, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the town's surgeon went to work. With a leather strap placed between Emmett's teeth to muffle his agonizing screams, the doctor probed his shattered flesh with cold steel forceps, digging into his back and shoulder to extract over a dozen jagged lead pellets. The sharp metallic clatter of bloody buckshot dropping into a tin basin echoed through the pharmacy. However, several pieces of lead had penetrated too deeply, lodging themselves precariously against his spinal cord and vital organs. Removing them was deemed a fatal risk. They were left permanently embedded in his tissue. The surgeon had not saved his life. He had simply transformed Emmett's own skeleton into a heavy, aching reliquary of the Coffeyville massacre. As soon as he was physically capable of standing without collapsing, the full crushing weight of the American judicial system descended upon him. There was no prolonged trial, no sympathetic jury. The evidence was the 23 bullet holes in his own flesh and the butchered bodies of his brothers. Swiftly convicted of second-degree murder, the heavy, iron-barred gates of the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing slammed shut behind him. For 14 unbroken years, the young man who had once ridden freely across the vast, open plains of the Indian Territory was compressed into a suffocating, windowless cage of cold limestone and unyielding steel. The physical reality of his survival was a daily, relentless agony. The penitentiary was bitterly cold. With every harsh Kansas winter that seeped through the damp prison walls, the lead pellets still embedded near his spine would contract and ache, sending sharp, radiating spikes of blinding pain down his legs. He walked with a permanent stiff limp, his body a broken, badly mended machine. He spent his days in absolute mandated silence, performing hard manual labor in the prison tailor shop. His calloused hands moved mechanically over coarse canvas fabrics, but his mind remained perpetually trapped in the past. He was haunted every single night by the vivid, deafening memories of Death Alley, the suffocating smell of cordite, the terrified screams of the draft horses, and the sight of Bob's lifeless eyes staring blankly into the mud. Yet while Emmett rotted in the damp silence of his cell, a profound and irreversible cultural shift was occurring beyond the prison walls. The 1890s bled rapidly into the 20th century, and the world fundamentally accelerated. When Governor Edward W. Hoke finally granted him a pardon in 1907, a 36-year-old Emmett Dalton stepped out of the prison gates and into a completely alien metropolis. The rhythmic, reassuring clip-clop of hooves on dirt had been violently replaced by the mechanical, guttural roar of the internal combustion engine. The vast, unbroken frontier canopy was now sliced into rigid fractions by harsh black telephone wires. The Wild West, the lawless, blood-soaked expanse that had birthed his family's arrogant reign, had been entirely paved over, sanitized, and domesticated. He was a 19th century phantom violently thrust into a rapidly industrializing reality. Initially, Emmett possessed a genuine, fleeting opportunity to completely disappear into a quiet, respectable life. Waiting for him outside the prison gates was Julia Johnson, a woman of extraordinary loyalty who had waited an agonizing 14 years for a man completely broken by buckshot. They married shortly after his release, offering Emmett the ultimate peaceful sanctuary away from the blood and the gunfire. He sought a respectable anonymity, trying to work quietly as a tailor and a legitimate merchant alongside his devoted wife. Yet the brutal, unforgiving reality of the capitalist ecosystem quickly asserted itself. Legitimate society, which publicly championed the concept of rehabilitation, fundamentally refused to employ the man. His surname was a radioactive brand. Whenever a prospective employer or a landlord discovered they were speaking to the lone survivor of the Dalton Gang, the doors of polite society firmly slammed shut. He was treated with a nauseating mixture of sheer terror and morbid fascination, not as a citizen who had paid his debt, but as a caged beast temporarily let out for public viewing. The psychological tragedy here is profound. Emmett had the love of a fiercely loyal woman and a chance at pure, unvarnished redemption. But as the sting of poverty set in, he made a cold calculation. He willingly traded the quiet dignity of a private life with Julia for the grotesque, highly public spectacle of his own infamy. The supreme, bitter irony of his existence crystallized one afternoon as he stood on a bustling street corner. Emmett watched, paralyzed by disbelief, as ordinary, law-abiding commuters eagerly purchased cheap, sensationalized dime novels from a local newsstand. The vibrant, gaudy covers boldly featured the fictionalized exploits of the Dalton Gang. He saw his brothers, the very men he had watched, choke on their own arterial blood in a filthy alleyway, depicted as dashing, romantic knights of the plains. The brutal, unvarnished reality of Coffeyville had been entirely erased. The American public was actively generating massive wealth from his family's trauma, completely divorcing the entertainment value of the shootouts from the grotesque physical agony of the bullet wounds. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of societal rejection and cultural exploitation that Emmett Dalton experienced a profound, chilling epiphany. He realized the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of the modern economy. The capitalist system did not actually despise the outlaw. It merely despised the outlaw who failed to incorporate. The violence of Coffeyville was no longer considered a heinous crime by the masses. It was highly lucrative intellectual property. Emmett possessed something that no hack writer in a New York publishing house could ever replicate: absolute, unvarnished authenticity. He exclusively owned the physical scars, the notorious surname, and the first-hand memory of the slaughter. He abandoned the futile pursuit of quiet respectability. If the American public was so desperately hungry to consume the blood of his brothers, Emmett decided with a cold, unforgiving pragmatism that he would become the sole proprietor of the abattoir. He packed his meager belongings, carrying the heavy lead in his spine and the ghosts of his brothers in his mind, and looked towards the western horizon. A new, insatiable industry was rapidly taking root in the sun-drenched citrus groves of Southern California, a corporate machine entirely dedicated to the manufacturing of moving illusions. The nascent motion picture industry was actively hunting for authentic Western narratives to feed a ravenous global audience. Emmett Dalton was no longer a terrified bank robber fleeing a posse. He was a shrewd, calculating entrepreneur heading directly towards the cameras, fully prepared to trade his family's blood for a Hollywood paycheck. The brilliant, unforgiving sunlight of Southern California in 1918 offered a stark, surreal contrast to the freezing, gun-smoke-choked skies of Kansas. On a sprawling, dusty backlot in Los Angeles, a meticulous and grotesque resurrection was taking place. Emmett Dalton had not merely arrived in Hollywood, he had completely integrated himself into its capitalist machinery. He had formed the Emmett Dalton Historical Pictures Corporation, effectively corporatizing his own trauma. The young man who had once bled out in the mud of Coffeyville was now a producer, a screenwriter, and a leading man, preparing to shoot his cinematic magnum opus, a silent film entitled Beyond the Law. The set was a painstakingly constructed wooden replica of the Coffeyville Plaza. Fake storefronts, painted brick facades, and a meticulously crafted reproduction of the fatal alleyway had been erected by carpenters who had never smelled real gunpowder. For Emmett, walking onto this set was an exercise in profound, almost unfathomable psychological compartmentalization. He retreated into the dressing room, surrounded by the heavy scent of grease paint and theatrical powder, and engaged in a macabre ritual. He stripped off his modern suit and strapped on a heavy leather gun belt, sliding a prop revolver into the holster. He donned a heavy coat and a Stetson hat, exact replicas of the garments that had been shredded by Carrie Seaman's shotgun blast 26 years earlier. When the director called for action, the heavy wooden cameras began to manually crank, capturing the silent black and white pantomime of the slaughter. Emmett Dalton stepped into the artificial dirt of the replica alleyway, acting out the very moments that had destroyed his family. The sheer chilling absurdity of the scene defied rational comprehension. Emmett stood under the hot, artificial Klieg lights and watched as hired stuntmen, dressed in the exact likeness of Bob and Great Dalton, simulated their final, desperate moments. Unfazed by the sight of his brother's ghosts, he did not suffer a crippling breakdown. Instead, he watched with the cold, critical eye of a businessman protecting a highly lucrative investment. He actively instructed the actors on how to fall correctly, how to clutch their chests, and how to mimic the sudden, violent collapse of a human body struck by high-velocity lead. He was meticulously directing the choreography of his own family's execution. He stood by calmly as the stagehands applied fake blood, a dark, sticky concoction, to the stuntmen's clothing, perfectly mimicking the arterial spray that had permanently stained the Kansas paving stones. There was no government agency or Pinkerton detective holding a gun to his head, forcing him to endure this psychological reenactment. There was no desperate, starving necessity driving him to the backlot. The capitalist engine of the entertainment industry had simply offered him a contract, and Emmett willingly signed it in exchange for his most traumatic memories. Every time the camera operator turned the crank, Emmett was essentially digging up the shallow graves of Bob and Great, placing their butchered corpses on public display. He had discovered that the American public, the descendants of the very people who had fired upon him, were now perfectly willing to queue around city blocks and pay silver coins to watch a sanitized, celluloid version of the massacre. The air on the set smelled of hot celluloid and catering, a safe, sterile environment where the violence carried no physical consequences. By willingly transforming his family's blood into a script, Emmett had fully embraced the darkest, most cynical truth of the 20th century. Personal trauma, when packaged within the safe confines of a cinema screen, was the ultimate, inexhaustible cash crop. Emmett Dalton did not die with his boots on in a dusty street choking on his own blood. He passed away in his bed in 1937 at the age of 66, transitioning seamlessly from a wanted bank robber into a wealthy, highly respected real estate broker in Los Angeles. To the casual observer, it's the ultimate American redemption story, but looking closely at his final years reveals a masterpiece of sheer hypocrisy. As his bank account swelled with Hollywood money and real estate commissions, Emmett embarked on a bizarre, self-appointed moral crusade. He frequently stood before church congregations and youth groups, lecturing young boys on the evils of crime, solemnly preaching his famous mantra, "The biggest fool on earth is the one who thinks he can beat the law." Yet he delivered these righteous sermons while wearing expensive, hand-tailored suits paid for entirely by the blood money of his past. He was condemning the very violence that had financed his luxurious Californian lifestyle. He published a second highly lucrative book, When the Daltons Rode, continuing to squeeze every last drop of profit from the corpses of his brothers while publicly masquerading as a reformed moral compass. But this comfortable facade masked a profound spiritual surrender. To secure his affluent Californian existence, Emmett willingly fed the horrific tragedy of his family into the grinding jaws of the American entertainment machine. He allowed the brutal reality of Coffeyville to be scrubbed clean and repackaged as profitable cinematic fodder, permanently reducing his brothers to Hollywood caricatures. The authentic blood that stained the Kansas paving stones was entirely erased, replaced by the sterile illusion of the silver screen. The story of Emmett Dalton remains a chilling, cautionary tale. If the saga of Jesse James proved that a capitalist system is willing to pay to hunt a man down, Emmett's life reveals something infinitely darker. The system doesn't always need an assassin's bullet to destroy a man's soul. Sometimes it merely needs to offer him a camera, a cut of the box office, and the promise of fame. As the ghost of the frontier fades into history, it leaves us with one deeply uncomfortable question. If the spotlight offered you a lifetime of absolute financial security, would you have the moral fortitude to walk away, or would you smile, step into the light, and sell the ghosts of your own family to the cheering crowd?